Hello, this is Ina, and today I would like to show you my new junk journal dedicated to French wine. This is the biggest format I have ever created. I will put all the measurements and details in the description below. I have entitled this journal Sommelier de Ritz, and here is why. The cover comes from a vintage wine menu of the famous Ritz Hotel in Paris. This fact alone makes it very special. But apart from that, it is so incredibly beautiful and luxurious. When studying it more closely, I noticed an inscription at the back, J. Bettenfeld, Paris. And I carried out my research. I have discovered that there exists, even today, a famous leatherwork and gilding workshop in Paris, Bettenfeld Rosenblum, which was founded in 1895 by Jean Bettenfeld, then only under his own name. Given that after his death in 1942 the workshop's name was slightly modified, we can presume that this cover was created at some point between 1895 and 1942. For the spine, I have decided to use a fragment from an antique hemp or linen sack. The fabric is quite rough in texture and has several areas of visible darning. I have lined it with a robust yet flexible lining like this, and I have covered the backside by the hemp fabric like this, so there are 3 layers in total. In fact, by this journal I wanted to pay tribute not only to the excellence and luxury of the best French wines, but also to all the hard work behind. That is why there is this combination of very luxurious materials and quite simple and rough materials. For the closure, I have used 2 spare links from the chain from my own vintage chandelier. It is actually in my studio and it dates back to 1960s. By the way, the ribbon comes from a piece of vintage black silk velvet fabric from 1930s. So let's have a look inside. Yes, I did not mention. I have attached the metal closure pieces with an antique gold thread trim featuring grapes. I have preserved the original burgundy silk lining from the Ritz wine menu. Of course, I have had to reinforce it with a sturdy lining. Here you can see the first page of the Ritz wine menu. I am absolutely enchanted by the elegance of the design and this soft brown color. And here I have added a small accent. This is a fragment from an antique French wine bottle foil. This is a part of a different story. Some time ago, purely by chance, in one of flea markets, I stumbled upon a real treasure. One gentleman was selling a whole bunch of all possible material from his grandfather, who used to be a wine merchant and also a wine barrel maker in 1910s, 1920s. Here is his photo and his brass nameplate. Isn't it amazing? Among other things, there were plenty of unused wine bottle foils like this. I have also embellished this page with some antique ticking fabric. And here you can see some subtle and yet gorgeous antique French print and cotton fabric from early 1800s, known as Oberkampf manufacture. It has been salvaged from an antique quilt. So I have sewn the signatures to a hidden spine made of this fabric that I reinforced with some Tyvek paper, that is tear-proof paper. By the way, you might be curious to know that this journal contains in total more than 40 varieties of antique and vintage textiles. Here I have created 2 tuck spots of burgundy color gift wrapping paper with some antique gold thread trims. I have put here a blank page from a wine tasting book, probably a modern one. You can write down here the date of a meal, who were invited, what was on the menu, your comments. I have also added a vintage book page with some interesting information. You can see here a map of France with winemaking regions back in the 13th century. Here is a Roman times winemaking regions map, and this is a map of France with its winemaking regions in 1952. There is also a large champagne label with delicate embossing. I have included this vintage book page about the Burgundy wine, on which I stamped a grape's leaf. Here there is an antique wine trading card of Chateau Lafite Carcassonne with an explanation behind. Here to the right there is a page from a vintage book about French chateaus. Here it is. It is from 1991. Another beautiful image, another extract from a French wine vintage book. At the background there is an antique ledger page. By the way, this is quite rare to have the lines and printed text in such a burgundy color. A small pocket with a few labels. This one is antique, this one is vintage, and this one is probably modern. By the way, there are more than 130 wine labels in this journal in total. Of them, more than 100 are antique and vintage. Here I have decorated this page with some antique wine bottle foils. To the right there is a textile trim from the fabric salvaged from a quilt dating back to the 18th century. It's amazing how all the colors remain so vivid after all these years. Here there is the other side of the ledger. We can see a ledger page. We can see that it dates 1912. I have created a side pocket using a wallpaper sampler. More beautiful wine labels, vintage. This is a blank page from a vintage wine cellar logbook where you can journal, keep notes about your wine cellar, or just write down your impressions about the wines tasted. I have embellished these pages, just stamping them with a wine cork like this. And this beautiful image comes from a vintage book about wine harvesting. I will show you this book in a second. Here it is, Les Vendanges. It is from 2000. Here to the right there is another page from an antique French ledger from the 19th century. It has a print or stamp of a grape leaf. Indeed, the nature is the most beautiful designer, isn't it? I have embellished the page with an antique wine label, a fragment from a vintage wine label, a beautiful image from a vintage book, and a tiny fabric scrap. Here there is a tack spot from another fragment of the wine label with some wine labels. This Saint-Emilion is antique. This is a vintage one. A lovely image from a vintage book and a champagne label. Here to the right there is a page from a vintage French business directory from 1940s. This page is dedicated to the winemaking companies and to the wines. Here there is another page from a vintage book about French wine. I have created these two shallow pockets using some vintage fabric with an image of grapes. The Rameau wine labels. This one is antique. Yes, and here behind this tack spot there is a page from an antique ledger of a French wine merchant. Here we can see his notes about sale of Burgundy, then other wine, to whom, when, at what price. This is quite an interesting historic document. Here there is an image of the interior of one of the Burgundy chateaus. It comes from this gorgeous antique album. Here I have glued an image from a vintage book. I have masked the space inside and around using some masking tape, and I have applied some gilding wax. I love how the subtle gold of the frame echoes with the wine color. I have also added this quite rough trim from an antique hemp sack for more texture and more interest. Another vintage directory page. I have glued here an antique wine label. Here behind this belly band there is a page from a vintage or antique book about wine. I do not remember. And I have created this small notebook. You can write down your wine or champagne tasting experience on some special occasions, maybe with your beloved person. Here in this side pocket there are labels, an antique wine label, a vintage one, a beautiful champagne label. Here there is a fussy cut of 2 wine glasses, an antique wine label, a gorgeous champagne label, a small belly band from antique silk velvet, plenty of space for your notes, more labels, a vintage wine label, an antique one, and another antique one. Another page from the vintage book about French chateaus. I have attached it with a scrap of leather. Behind there is plenty of space for journaling. To the right there is another antique ledger page, a vintage photo. Behind there is another vintage wine label and a page from a wine cellar book, or rather a booklet. Here, behind this dark spot, there is a very interesting antique document. It's a letter sent by a Bordeaux wine merchant to his clients in 1893, saying that 30 barrels of wine had been shipped and were expected to arrive shortly. This is the second half of the page of the Ritz wine menu that we saw before. I have cut out a frame from a wine label and I have decorated this image in the center. I have also embellished this page with some antique rich Bordeaux color velvet trim. And I have made a bookmark from a piece of leather coming from the spine of the Ritz wine menu that I used for the cover of this journal. You can see how gorgeous this leather is and how shabby it is. You know, I'm just wondering how many hands held it, how many famous persons were choosing their wines while holding it. I have embellished it with 2 glass pearls. This one is vintage and this one is modern bohemian glass. I will show you from where I took this one. This is a vintage decorative piece. Here to the right there is a page from an antique photo album that I have embellished with this fussy cut image and some antique fabric. This page comes from a vintage wine cellar logbook with some more antique textile. These wine labels were glued by the wine collector who kept that book. I have just embellished this page with some fragments of antique French wine bottle foils and some images. This page also comes from a vintage book. This label has been glued on the page. To the right there is an extract from an antique ledger on which I have sewn a side pocket from some vintage fabric depicting a bird eating grapes. I have included plenty of interesting things here. There is an extract from a vintage book, about exactly wine labels. I have added this pretty small label. Here there is a vintage invoice for one barrel of Beaujolais wine dating 1948. There are two pieces of antique marbled end papers that can be used as journaling cards. Two beautiful wine labels. Here you can see two delicate Miro eco prints of grape leaves. I have made two tuck spots, one with the antique hemp fabric. More wine labels. This one is antique Bordeaux, this one is vintage. These both are vintage. Here there is a vintage invoice for wine. Here on this page I have glued an antique wine label. Pages from a vintage book. Here there is a label of Bordeaux white wine. A journaling card with a tuck spot. An image from a vintage book, an antique wine label, and a book page fragment listing dishes that go well with white wine. So I imagine that you would probably wish to write down your experience of tasting a good white wine here. Here there is a tuck spot made of a piece of antique tapestry. An antique book page with a lovely image. Here there is a whole range of antique wine bottle foils with different shades of yellow. It's like different shades of white wine color. And this spread here is dedicated to my dear Alsace, the region famous for its wines, especially white wines. Here there is a big antique ledger page. I have embellished the pages with fragments from an antique linen with an embroidery sample. There are some beautiful antique labels, some antique embroidery scrap, antique wine labels, the region map with its vineyards, some antique wine labels, a journaling card, plenty of space for journaling here. Here I have created a side pocket from a dust jacket from a vintage book. I believe it was this book. From 1992. I have included two antique Burgundy wine labels, a blank page with a gorgeous grape leaf stamp, To the left, there is very beautiful antique fabric trim. This is an antique hand-woven linen made in Alsace and known as Kelch. To the right, there is a page from that antique chateau album that I showed you before. I have glued this image and I have added a piece of an antique trim. Here I have made a pocket from a reinforced antique Burgundy wine label. Inside I have put a tag made of a vintage book scrap. To the right you can see an extract from the Hotel Ritz wine list. I have folded a band of antique fabric around the edge and I have sewn it so that it can be used as a tuck spot from both sides. Champagne label, an antique wine label, another, this one is vintage wine label. This one is antique, a beautiful champagne label. Here there is a piece of antique fabric with delicate florals, another pocket made of a reinforced antique wine label. I have put inside 3 different bookmarks that I made using vintage papers and antique textiles. For example, this textile scrap comes from an antique silk lady corset. Here there is an antique ledger page. I have left the space for journaling. I have only glued and then hand stitched scraps from a vintage apron. Here I have created a side pocket using an image from a vintage book. More labels. 1979. Another one. This is an antique one. I have glued this one on a scrap of an antique ledger so it can be used as a journaling card. To the right there is a large ledger page embellished with distressed antique fabric. Inside there is a gorgeous champagne label. And here, I believe, is a perfect place to write down your impressions from tasting a good red wine. And this is a page from a vintage book about the wine in paintings. I will show you this book in a moment. Here it is. (1997). In fact, I loved this book so much that I found a second one for my own collection. So the first one will end up in many journals because I like using original pages, and the second one will be intact just for my own pleasure. Here there is another part of the vintage wine cellar logbook. I have just added this antique label, an antique textile scrap. Here there is another antique ledger page with a vintage wine label. I have also embellished this page with a scrap of antique fabric salvaged from a quilt. Here there is lots of space for journaling, a kind of hidden shelf pocket with lots of labels, a vintage wine label, another one. This one is antique and a vintage one. Here I have embellished this page with a fussy cut of grapes from a gift wrapping paper. This page comes from a wine menu of a restaurant, a vintage one. I do not remember from which restaurant it comes. Here on this page I am paying tribute to one of the most prestigious wines in the world, a true jewel of the Bordeaux region, Chateau Margaux.